Traditionally, the collapse of the Soviet Union is often blamed on Gorbachev because of his failed reforms. However, everyone forgets that he inherited a country essentially in crisis, for which Leonid Brezhnev was largely responsible. It was the short-sighted policies of the past that largely led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, a fact many unjustly overlook. And in this video we will discuss how Brezhnev's policies contributed to the Union's collapse and examine the major flaws in his governance. The period of so-called stagnation is remembered both as a golden era of stability and prosperity and as a time of internal stagnation in the power and economy of the Soviet Union. It was during Brezhnev's reign that the Soviet Union significantly lagged behind Western countries technologically and economically. The country experienced extremely low economic growth, and its industry as a whole failed to grow or increase efficiency. The Soviet Union continued to develop extensively, meaning that progress relied solely on expanding production and arable land. At the same time, technological development, labor rationalization, productivity, and other aspects were ignored. Shortages became an integral part of the Brezhnev and post-Brezhnev years. In addition to the acute scarcity of many goods, the range of available products was extremely limited, with some essential goods simply non-existing in nature. After the Stalinist 5-year plans and the Khrushchev experiments, the Soviet Union began to reach its limits. The effects of years of Bolshevik rule over Russia began to manifest. The first sign of trouble was the food crisis of 1962-1963, marked by a surge in meat prices, which were conventionally addressed through price increases. By the summer of 1962, meat prices had risen by 25–30%, but simultaneously, shortages of another vital product, bread, began to emerge. For the first time since the wartime rationing system was abolished, urban areas introduced a practice limiting bread purchases to 2.5 kilograms per person. The most severe austerity measures were seen in canteens, where raids were initiated to control the proper slicing of bread. Bread was no longer free, but had to be paid for separately at self-service canteens, and extra fees were charged. Then came the drought of 1963, worsening the bread situation. Flour began disappearing from shops, and problems with supplying white bread even emerged in Leningrad. Restrictions were imposed in bread shops, with only loaves of grayish bread mixed with peas being sold. Raids were conducted, during which flour supposedly purchased for feeding livestock and poultry was confiscated. But even this did not yield the desired results. It was then decided, for the first time in Soviet history, to purchase grain abroad. The consumer market was quite limited and outdated compared to the West. For example, the Zhiguli, the main car of the Soviet Union until its collapse, was based on the Fiat 124, which ceased production in the West in the early 70s. Moreover, the model itself was far from the ideals of car manufacturing. The industrial sector also faced an unfavorable situation. While its growth rate from 1956 to 1960 was 64.8%, it dropped to 51% from 1961 to 1965. National income growth was only 10% in the 1950s and dropped to 6.5% in the first half of the 1960s. The growth rate of labor productivity decreased from 8 to 6% during the same period. Overall, while the propaganda noise still existed, there were no real results of communist labor. Over the last 6 years, the pace of Soviet economic development decreased by about 3 times, and in agriculture by about 10 times. During this time, the growth of trade turnover decreased by about 4 times. Real incomes of the population also significantly declined, reaching extremely low levels. Meanwhile, the country was expending colossal resources on the development of the military-industrial complex. In the early 80s, the share of military spending reached 23% of the entire national product of the Soviet Union. 5 to 8 million people were involved in the defense industry, while in the United States there were only about 2 million. In fact, the Brezhnev era was an attempt at serious economic reform, known as the Kosygin reform. The reform aimed to expand the powers of enterprises, allowing them to independently manage their resources and carry out modernization. Economic indicators such as profitability and profit were introduced. Overall, the reform aimed to liberalize the economy and increase its efficiency. The reform was successfully tested in a number of enterprises, where efficiency increased by 50%. However, it was rolled back due to ideological disagreements. Many party officials with Brezhnev support believed that the reforms did not correspond to the socialist economy, as they largely deviated from centralized control. Kosygin himself was accused of flirting with the West. Especially after the Prague Spring of '68, party members began to fear any signs of liberalization in the country, so the reform was essentially rolled back. Overall, the period of stagnation essentially led to the future economic crisis in the country, during which the ill-fated perestroika was initiated, which many people hate so much. By the way, talk of reforms was begun before Gorbachev. They were planned by both Chernenko and Andropov. However, due to their short terms in office, they never managed to implement their plans. A serious problem of abortions was on the agenda. The number of abortions was huge, about 100 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 49, and their quality was extremely low. Most often, curettage was performed, leading to serious complications, including infertility and even fatal cases, especially with the repeat procedures. The mortality rate in the country was steadily increasing in all age groups. During the period of stagnation, it increased from 6.9 to 10.4 per thousand, with a particularly noticeable increase in the over 50 age group, almost 20%, and for 40-year-olds by more than 40%. At the same time, morbidity indicators worsened, while in the world, even in developing countries, they improved. Despite the reduction in mortality from infectious diseases, mortality from diseases of the circulatory system significantly increased. Over 20 years, unnatural mortality, including accidents, poisonings, and injuries, increased by 58%. In 1985, life expectancy was lower than in 1958. The situation was particularly critical in rural areas of the USSR, where male life expectancy decreased to 58 years. Medical care also suffered from a lack of qualified personnel and equipment. Doctors usually concentrated in hospitals affiliated with universities or research organizations, leaving medical care for the population without proper attention. All these factors led to the USSR being in a worse position compared to other countries. Spending on healthcare was decreasing. The quality of medical services lagged behind Western countries, and the availability of assistance for the population significantly deteriorated. Corruption flourished everywhere. The term gratitude to a doctor for a consultation became so common that it was not even perceived as a bribe. In one issue of the magazine Crocodile for 1979, a real case is described in a dental clinic in Tbilisi. A doctor demanded a bottle of wine for removing a wisdom tooth and brandy for removing a root tooth. This information reached the chief physician, causing a gathering of staff, among whom opinions were divided. While some condemned such practice, others considered it normal. One doctor even said, if a person has done good, why shouldn't he expect gratitude? Medical professions became associated with bribery, especially dental technicians. Obtaining medical assistance without bribes became more difficult, and in the 1980s, citizens began to turn to alternative folk medicine en masse. By that time, doctors' work was assessed through private payment for services. A system of fees for hospitalization, examinations, surgeries, and etc. emerged. Thus, for free healthcare, Soviet people regularly paid, and the healthcare sector finally became mired in corruption. Doctors started taking bribes, not providing access to advanced treatment methods. The quality of service was low due to the lack of appropriate equipment and specialists. Disparities in the number of doctors and equipment between republics were noticeable. For example, in the Georgian SSR, the number of doctors exceeded the all-Union average by 31%, while in the USSR there were not enough beds for patients. Many medical specialties became in short supply. This artificial division and attachment to place of registration caused dissatisfaction among the population and struck the ideal of friendship of peoples. In official festive concerts, the unity of the Soviet peoples became increasingly ostentatious, not smoothing over national contradictions. Xenophobia and active national struggle contradicted the ideal of friendship among peoples, and incidents of national enmity became more frequent. Moreover, it's worth noting the incidents of beating Russians in Tashkent in 1969, which occurred after a football match between Tashkent's Pakhtakor and Moscow's Spartak. After Pakhtakor lost 1-2, crowds of Uzbeks began beating Russians. According to eyewitnesses, hooligan crowds chased Russian women, and chase turned into persecution of girls and women, leaving them naked on the streets of Tashkent. "Go back to your Russia. We will smear your blood on the roofs." Such statements were often made against Russians. Moreover, many participants had the impression that the police squads sent to suppress the riots not only did not take active actions, but also sympathized with the Uzbeks. They tried to pull the hooligans away from the victims, but that was all they did. Also unchanged was the wage within one profession. People could only receive the name grade at the factory, and changing jobs was practically impossible. Most people were attached to the factory or enterprise for their entire lives, because retiring tied to their place of registration. State housing created an illusion of future security, but in reality it turned out to be a binding factory, depriving people of freedom of choice. The government used housing to control migration flows and blackmail enterprises. People became hostages of their housing and could not change their place of residence at their direction, because they could not sell or exchange their apartments. The Soviet leadership already in the early 70s leaned on the so-called oil needle, which also largely led to the collapse of the Union. It was precisely the decrease in oil prices in the 80s that led to the severe crisis in the country and budget deficit. Why did this happen? Because the Soviet leadership from early 70s completely shifted to the export of raw materials, while not developing the rest of the economy. Thus, literally within 10 years, the Soviet Union turned into a country that exports raw materials and imports goods. Clearly, this indicates an unhealthy economy and strong dependence on world oil prices. And the oil dependence of the Soviet Union, I have a separate video on the channel, the link I will leave in the description. The Afghan War, which dealt a serious blow to the reputation and economy of the Union, was also initiated by the previous leadership and lasted until 1989. The Soviet government, in many ways, decided on a certain adventure and invaded Afghanistan, thereby involving the country in a fruitless 10-year war. The Afghan War became a new phase of confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, and ended the era of détente, which was marked by rapprochement between the countries. Moreover, the war, of course, was extremely costly. This was especially felt in times of crisis. According to various estimates, from $3 to $8 billion per year were spent on the war. In addition to military development spending, the Soviet Union traditionally spent a lot of resources to support communist regimes and movements worldwide. Nicaragua, Angola, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Ethiopia – these are just a few countries supported by the Soviet government. I won't even list the communist parties and movements around the world, there are simply hundreds of them. Supporting such regimes and movements led to serious expenditures, estimated in billions of dollars. And the worst part was that all such regimes was constantly dependent on the Union and could not exist on their own. In fact, after the collapse of the Union, almost all socialist countries fell. State institutions were regularly subjected to corruption, and theft in enterprises reached catastrophic proportions. Discussions at the Central Committee Secretariat in 1981 revealed that the number of thefts had doubled in 2 years, and the value of stolen goods had quadrupled. Railway workers and water transport workers accounted for 40% and 60% of thefts, respectively. Food standards were constantly decreasing, and measures introduced by Carter proved to be extremely sensitive. The ban on slaughtering cattle did not lead to an increase in meat production, and consumption in some regions dropped to 2 kilograms per year. The economy was steadily deteriorating, and the 5-year plans were poorly balanced. People lost trust in the Soviet currency, leading to fantastic levels of inflation. The consumption of luxury items, even if they weren't available in everyday life, became a stable trend. Queues and shortages of goods became commonplace, and plans were only half fulfilled. Moreover, corrupt schemes continued in the country, and high-ranking officials were involved in corruption. Even after the mafia was exposed around certain individuals, bribery and economic degradation persisted. The aging of the government apparatus began precisely during his rule. The average age deteriorated and exceeded 70 years. Older party members were often extremely conservative and opposed changes in the state. Brezhnev himself, in the last years of his rule, was in poor health and could not effectively govern the Union. By the way, this also explains the rapid demise of subsequent general secretaries. Chernenko and Andropov, who died at the ages of 73 and 69 years respectively. In general, as we can see, the main problems of the Soviet Union were accumulated precisely during Brezhnev's rule, and Gorbachev in essence could not effectively solve them. The period of the golden age of the Soviet Empire turned out to be false, and it was during these years that the foundation for its demise was laid. The Soviet Empire did not perish from openness and reforms, but drowned under its own burden, suppressing its people and engulfing itself in the whirlwind of its ambitions.